Welcome to Implicating the Real. Today's show is part 2 of the conversation began in the previous episode. Let's get right into it. Hope you enjoy.
So for the listener, I'm a quibbler, which means I have a lot of small quibbles when I read things. If you have not noticed, I'll sort of latch on to small things.
Joe, you're a quibbler, and I'm a welcomer of quibbles.
Okay.
So this is going to be a nice fit.
Okay. So we already talked about the room that changes size, right?
Mm-hmm.
So another one was, not only is our external physical reality created by consciousness, but our body is also structured by consciousness, right?
I mean, it's kind of part of it, right?
Yeah.
Part of external physical reality. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and in some sense, this makes sense to anybody who has like just a normal understanding of like human physiology, right? Like the way your emotions change the electrical impulses of your body when you're awake versus when you're asleep. There's different things happening in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Like stressors will cause different hormones to be active, right? You know, your emotions might change sort of the way that you retain material in terms of like body weight, things like that. There's all these different ways that like your mind could change your physical body. But Seth seems to go further and say that, you know, it seems like the impression is that humans could actually just physically change their body any way they want to if they just got good at, you know, conceptualizing the way that Seth does. You know, in the same way that Seth can change their environment to be any kind of outside scenario as possible. If you were at that level of consciousness, you could change your physical body to look like anything you want. Like you could be a 10-foot tall blue space alien or something.
I think what he's saying is when you get to where he's at, it won't be physical anymore. He would call it an image. He said you're always working with an image, and he relates that to what we know as the body. So he'll call the body the physical image.
So that's part of my question is, if you're at the level that Seth's on, can you not manifest physically? Because it seems like Seth doesn't ever do that.
I think, doesn't he say that in chapter 2 that he no longer does? Like they've like came through the physical system, learned its lessons, and now they're beyond it. And he has to, like, in that same way, just to like communicate with Jane, he has to reach back into like the consciousness that actually had physical existences are closer to Jane. So like it's kind of his pathway, his psychological pathway, just to channel it. But like the larger Seth entity is beyond the need for physical existence, is my impression. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in this system, need is equating to capability.
He's capable, but like I think it's just like, it's more that he's like graduated from physical existence.
Right, but I can graduate from school and still show up to pick up my brother, right? Like, I can go back to the high school and be like, beep, beep, you know,
Yeah.
walk into the...
But you wouldn't like enroll in first grade again. I think
Sure.
it's that sort of thing.
Like he could, but he just won't.
You won't, because it'd be dumb. It'd be dumb for you to go back to first grade. I mean,
Well,
I think it's along the same lines.
yeah, and it seems like from the little bit that we got in these chapters, it seems like there's this interesting like difficulty in being able to pierce into the physical world. Because he talks about how Jane like pierces through at some point, and that there's almost this like small interdimensional window that he can creep through, I think is like the metaphor he uses.
Yeah.
And how there has to be like a psychological fit between him and Jane, where it's not just he could possess anybody.
Right.
It's like there needs to be compatibility with the channeler.
Yeah. And they have some sort of history in like previous physical incarnations, and they also have like a psychological history. And so basically one of his main ideas is that like free will always operates. And so like I think maybe the major hang up is that Jane would need to consent, and without that psychological familiarity, nobody would actually consent to something like Seth like coming through their consciousness.
And here's the weird thing, right? Like their consciousness in terms of like their personality, but also their consciousness in terms of their physical reality, right? Because they're the same thing. Or like one projects the other one.
What do you mean they?
Like,
Thanks. I got lost there.
so like a human person, if my consciousness is projecting the reality around me, would I have to have free will to allow other people into my physical space? Could I like mentally decide to boot somebody out of my reality?
Well, I think this is kind of where we kind of touched on with, like, we were talking about the room changing sizes, but then we got to the bigger question, I think, is like what happens when there's like two people. And so like the way free will can always operate, like Seth would say that, like, so now there's three of us in this room that, you know, there's each of us are creating our own version of this table. Sorry, I just got lost again.
No, but this comes into another quibble I was going to skip, but we can talk about, right? Is like, because in the book, the example is the tree, right? You can view a tree as a person, or you could view it as a microbe. And I think Seth says something about like one other size of thing. Like there's these three different things that are observing the tree. And to them, the tree looks very different because of their perspective.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the tree is supposed to be both the same tree, but not the same tree.
Yeah, so this is way ahead of, you know, where we are, but it's a valid question, and I had the same thing. But basically there is like some, you wouldn't call it objective, but like there is some reality where there's a reference point that we're all using to create our versions of it. And the way that so I remembered what I just kind of lost earlier when you asked, like, could you just pop me out of the reality that you're creating? Basically what's happening, in order for everything to have free will and always be in operation, is that there has to be like almost an infinite amount of probabilities. So we're always like switching into realities where we consent to more or less the same thing. As long as you and I are in the same room, we are choosing probabilities to have each other in the same room. Because we live in this physical world, there's bits, he'll get into this, but there's like basic assumptions that are basically like the rules of the game that we signed up for when we decided we want to have a physical existence.
Gotcha.
And we follow those, and that's why, like, you can't just like make me disappear. Even if I was willing to consent to disappear, that would violate the basic assumptions of this earthly physical existence.
So does that also explain why like my emotions don't directly translate into things happening physically to my body? There has to be a mediation in terms of like physical processes. You know, like you can dissect a person and you can say like, oh, there's a nervous system that communicates the information down to the limbs. But if I'm just creating my own reality and I didn't know anything about physiology, couldn't it be the case that I'm just hollow on the inside and my limbs just move because I make them move, you know? Like there's no reason that the nerve system would need to be there.
I think there is. I don't know if I have the answer, but like it probably goes back to those same.
Like that's just the rules, is you have to have a nerve system.
Yeah, because I mean, if we cut your leg open and it was hollow, we'd be in a different sort of existence, you know? There is like consistency to where we're at, right?
And then that's my other question too, is what about if you get into a situation where there isn't consistency, or it appears not, because appearance becomes reality, right? And this is tricky because especially if you relate to your own body, like I think it's a very common occurrence to have, for example, like a very sharp knife. You could cut yourself and not realize that you're bleeding, but you are still bleeding. So it's like, did you create that state of affairs for your body if you're not aware of it?
Yeah, because, well, again, it's the inner ego that's the creating. That's the part that's like creating, and the outer ego is the part that's experiencing that creation. And so like we're the part that's kind of like has this experimental existence. The outer ego is kind of like the feedback system. You know, it's almost like playing a video game where like the inner ego is creating the game. You know, we've agreed on the rules before we started, and your outer ego is the character inside the game. And bridging back to the inner ego kind of entails that you wake up as the person outside of the game playing the game.
Right. And in this sense, waking up isn't just, if I was the character in the game, it's not that like Street Fighter Ken's going to jump out of the screen and be in the physical world. It's that, my mom's yelling at me that like I need to put the game away because I've been playing for too long and I have to get up and do something else besides the game, right? It's that larger ego that's waking up.
Yeah. I mean, we can't take that analogy too seriously, but it is humorous that way. But like you're waking up to the larger consciousness and like you're remembering, oh, I'm not just, this Street Fighter. I'm so much more.
Right. Could you be wrong about your perceptions, right? Like if you're creating everything, like because Seth says that the senses aren't sensing things, they're creating things. So if that's the case, if I see an illusion, it's not the case that I'm being fooled by the illusion. It's the case that the world is actually doing something counterintuitive because I'm being fooled, right?
The world being like an objective thing outside of you?
Yeah, or like the rules of the game are getting bent because I'm being fooled by an illusion. Like if I see an optical illusion that creates something which like couldn't physically be the case, it would actually physically be the case. It's just the rules of physics would be broken in that certain circumstance, right? Like, there's the thing of like the room where like somebody's really short and then they walk towards you and they get bigger as they're walking towards you. It wouldn't be that I'm simply incorrect about the room. It's that the room actually has this like very strange quality to it that like bends the rules of physical reality, right?
I'm not sure I'm following it. I mean, that sort of room isn't bending physical reality. It's just playing on your perceptual mechanism, right?
Right, but the conceit is that your perceptual mechanism is creating reality. It's not the other way around.
Yeah. I don't understand the full extent of what he means by creating reality through the senses, but I do know like Buddhists say the same thing. And I've always just gathered that it just means like it creates reality in the sense that that is the information we're using to make our picture and our conception of reality. Does that make sense?
Can you say that again? Sorry.
That sensorial data is what we're using to create our picture or conception of reality. And so that's how it's creating it.
Yeah, but where does that data come from?
Well, the inner ego is creating that. Like I don't understand, like it's maybe something where we get lost in our ideas of that existence has to mean space and there has to be like this loop, but the inner ego is creating that information. The outer ego is experiencing that information.
Right. I'm just saying, like, if there's this consistency where everyone has agreed to the rules ahead of time before starting the physical universe, there shouldn't be, like, illusions. Like, optical illusions shouldn't happen. Like, they should be impossible to happen if we agreed ahead of time not to let them happen, right?
Yeah, but I don't know that we agreed that. I don't know if it's an agreement that optical illusions don't happen. And then I don't know if this is going to get clarified or if I have the capacity to clarify this particular question, but like I was going to relate that, the optical illusion to what I remembered I was going to say on your last point. It's just, but like in dreams, weird things happen that don't necessarily follow the rules that we have for physical objective existence. And one thing, I was trying to remember this in a conversation we were having a couple of weeks ago in the kitchen, but Seth has this conception of, the term is primary realities. And primary realities are basically these rules that are true across all dimensions. And so I think I brought up, walking isn't a primary reality because in a dream I can fly. But mobility is, because in all realities, I mean, he's saying these things. I don't have insight into all these dimensions, but like, so gravity isn't a primary reality because I can float in a dream. It's like, and I don't know if that answers either of your quibbles here, but it seemed like contextually relevant in some way.
Yeah, I guess if you like, it seems to me like the idea of primary reality sort of tracks onto the idea of like unnecessary, like unnecessary precursor to something existing, right?
It helps me make sense of things, like understanding, if we're calling this reality something else, Seth calls it a camouflage.
Right.
It's a limited version of a more broader reality. Understanding a primary reality helps me understand the whole picture.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing is there's the idea of like camouflages, or like one of the words I wrote down is like Seth talks about the world being like behind several different types of guise, like they're being camouflaged or hidden or something like that. And that seems to imply that there is a more fundamental, more like quote unquote real, true reality that's happening.
Yeah, and it took me a long time, and I'm still like contemplating that concept of camouflage reality, but like, what does that term mean? Like, I think of like a hunter in a forest wearing camouflage, where if you see it, it looks like a tree or a bush. And I think what Seth is saying is that there's a more vital reality than what you're able to see in that sense. And I think he's saying that about physical reality too. We have this picture of an objective physical world, but he's also saying hidden within that manifestation is all this is consciousness basically.
Yeah, like I have a quote written down. This might just be a paraphrase, but it's there are no barriers between systems, where systems is like planes of existence or whatever. The only differentiation is by the ability of personalities to see and manipulate.
Yeah, it's kind of like just a matter of focus, from what I understand.
Yeah, and that's a thing that in the text is kind of difficult to parse out because Seth talks about being, and maybe this might be a spatial location metaphor thing being the problem, but it's Seth seems to be talking about being in a different plane. But that plane is actually, if we take this quote seriously, just kind of an aspect of the one we already live in, right? It's a collapsing of these more fundamental worlds onto each other. And what we see as a plane of existence is really just an illusory sense of what the real world is like. It becomes idealism to the extent of like a Matrix analogy, where like our world is actually just all illusion.
Well, what I take when I hear that is the term illusion is too strong.
Okay.
Because even though he's calling this camouflage, it's still real. It's just limited. Like when I read the word camouflage in Seth's context, I try to also add the idea of it's a symbolic world. Like Seth will say that like broader consciousness is so much bigger than what can fit inside the structure of physical reality. So like there's so much more, and he's saying that about ourselves too, and wanting us to realize that we are just perceiving the parts that like cross this threshold that can fit inside, but there's like so much more there. And like we have to go, I don't even like this term, but we almost can't get away from it, but we have to go in to access that broader reality. Like I have this quibble with like the inside outside thing, because my quibble with it is it gets too much, it gives too much legitimacy to the idea of there being an outside world. He's saying that is basically there is no like space or distance, not in a physical sense.
Right, yeah. We're sort of mistaken about seeing the world physically.
Yeah, and understandably we're mistaken, right? Because we are this part of consciousness that cut itself off from its broader source, and we are a new development. Like I think he does say we are like a brand, in some sense, we're like a brand new consciousness, like experiencing this. I say that, and then I want to take it back too, because I think there's a distinction where like we definitely like our broader self is not new, but this outer ego part is kind of new, and it just grows up in this medium and then has to like discover the broader parts of both reality and our own selves.
Right. And then one other thing was like, this is a little less deep, but it's like kind of an interesting theme I noticed. And this might have to do with like when it was published. But do you remember the part in chapter 2 when he's talking about like emotions and like how he experiences emotions differently from humans?
Yeah, he said a couple of provocative things, and I didn't quite get to write them down yet.
He seems to be really down on emotions. Like he's not really a fan, you know?
Really?
He talks about like
We're gonna have to look up what he says.
the human experience being like people being afraid of their emotions and people like needing to hide their emotions and things. Which I suppose in some sense is true. It was just very strong language, you know?
Yeah, but he's not saying that he's not a fan of emotions. He's saying that it's to our detriment that we're afraid of our own emotions.
Yeah, I guess
He's saying that like he can't actually hide his emotions from people in his realm.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm reading more into it as the going theory of it being like an artistic representation that Jane is presenting.
Interesting.
Where it's like, if that's the way Jane is presenting this other being, that says something interesting about Jane's perspective on the world. Or like she sees the world as being where you have to hide your emotions and you have to be afraid of your emotions.
Yeah, and I think to the extent that Seth is commenting on the broader us of that time, I think she is often a fairly good representative of that.
Yeah.
Like if we get so far as like later on, Jane has like these pretty major health issues and Seth is there all along trying to like tell her how she's basically like, well, if I create my own reality, why am I suffering from this ailment?
Right.
And it's very illuminating, I think, to see both what Seth says and what Jane says and how she feels and what she does do and what she doesn't do.
Right.
And in the end, she succumbs, like she dies at age 55 from what Western medical model would call arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis.
She dies from arthritis?
Well, it might be, I don't know if there's a more serious diagnosis, but like she just like slowly became crippled.
Wow.
It's pretty heavy, yeah.
That sounds like I'm kind of pumped to get to that part because that sounds like sort of an interesting perspective on it.
It is. It's both like interesting and sad and provocative, and I'm still not sure I can like understand it all, but I think there's a lot there to be understood.
Yeah. Did you have more stuff?
Let me all my stuff is kind of chapter 1 because I didn't fully know if we were going to get into this, and I ended up like more deeply reading than I had planned to, so it takes a little longer.
I'm glad because I feel like I took not as many notes on chapter 1 as I should have.
Let me just read some quotes and see if you have anything to jump off from. I call this seemingly unconscious the inner ego, for it directs inner activities. It correlates information that is perceived through the inner channels. It is the inner perceiver of reality that exists beyond the three-dimensional. It carries within it the meaning of each of your past existences. It looks into subjective dimensions that are literally infinite. And from these subjective dimensions, all objective realities flow. Anything there? That was just a little bit about the inner ego.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the goal, like, I guess maybe this is a thing for later on, right? When we get to other chapters. Because it seems like at this point, there are just a lot of questions, like, what is the goal of aligning with the inner ego? Like, what is the reason why this higher consciousness isn't able to perceive the world in the way that it needs to? And I guess maybe we don't need to answer that this time. Like, it could be good for the audience to not have those answers right away, but...
To the latter question, I think it's just that Seth no longer has the physical mechanism to like actually be in the world in the way we're in the world. He only has that through Jane. And as we read, we'll get snippets, but like at one point, like Jane's in trance and drinks some milk, and Seth is like, ew, this is what you call milk? And like he's referencing like his memory of milk from whatever past life, just stuff like that. Or he'll talk nostalgic. He'll look out the window and it's like snowing.
I think there's a part of that in the chapter we read,
Okay.
Where in some of the parentheses, it's like Seth, or no, not even the parentheses. Seth talks about like looking like wistfully out the window and being able to like experience the body and be like, ooh, I'm like experiencing the physical world.
So, I mean, I think that accounts for the second part of that question is like, he still could. It's like the first grade thing. He still could come back here and experience this, but there's kind of no reason to do so. And he's only reaching through here as a teacher to do this specific thing. And I don't know if you mentioned it yet. It'll probably be coming up pretty soon here, but like he says, like throughout the ages, there's these things called speakers. And basically they exist to like make sure like this information about reality like stays in the culture, and so they like just pop up and have these like extra intuitive abilities to like, and they become our like religious figures. And there can be like, it's not like there's speakers and then there's everybody else. It's like everybody else has a little bit of speaker in them, and then there's like all these variations.
Yeah, maybe we should have done that at the beginning. I think in chapter 1 he sort of enumerates all the things he's going to be doing. I should have made a list of that.
And we can still do that and because it's all together.
Yeah, because he says, I'm going to talk about my reasons for what I'm doing. I'm going to introduce myself. And then I know he says, I'm going to give an overview of like religions that have existed. And then there's like a little sort of like tidbit looking forward where he's like, I'm going to tell you about a religion you don't know about because everyone forgot about it,
Yeah.
And then I know at the end he talks about the cat too, right? There's going to be a part about like animals.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that too when you're like kind of questioning what you're saying something about a plane, and I remember him saying like their cat, Jane and Rob's cat, is its own plane.
Yeah, right?
So like he's saying like that's maybe this gets to the point too where you're like he's using so many these like synonyms for different things. I think it is kind of muddy in a way. Like it's just not this neat formulaic system in the sense that we want it to be. But like a cat is its own plane because if you were there, it's a totally separate, different experience with its own rules. Like even though it's in the same objective world as us, like being there subjectively makes it a totally different plane than what we're on.
So the thing that makes human beings similar to one another is that we're playing by the same game of being human beings. I'm doing air quotes.
Yeah, but I think you could even make a distinction that being Joe and being Michael are different planes. Maybe they're similar. They're more similar than they are to the cat plane, but they have to be like pretty different.
Interesting.
And that gets to kind of what we were saying earlier too, or what I was saying, that I think like, idealism lays importance on the subjective side. And so like if he is implying that the room feeling smaller is the distinction that matters rather than it actually being smaller.
Mm-hmm.
Even though he's saying it actually being smaller, I think that's his way of like saying like the subjective feeling of it being smaller is the only thing that really matters.
Yeah. Or the size change was never real in the first place, in the sense that you might think it is.
Yeah, in this sense, like the term actual refers to, I mean, if you're using the term actual and you're an idealist, you're referencing subjective experience rather than objective experience.
Right, yeah.
That's just like not intuitive to our conception.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's a good answer to that, honestly.
But you see, like, I'm like just like piecing this together from the way he phrases it, and then like you quibble with it, and I'm like having to like justify my understanding of it. But I think like he's doing these things both because our language is limited in the way you can explain any knowledge, and I think he has a deeper understanding of how this is going to sink in than we know. Like his family of consciousness is a teacher, and he's this higher being that's gone through this, like you started out saying, like this ancient being. He's lived all these existences, still is living all these different existences. He's got to have some crazy like insight about how to like lay this down where it's going to just like sink in ways that we don't really even understand.
Right, yeah.
For me, it just makes me think, and it keeps drawing me back. And I can't say that about a lot of stuff that I even like, like I'll read a book and it's like, oh, this is super interesting. And then I'm never really compelled to go back to it. This is different somehow.
It reminds me of a thing I've heard somebody say about the Quran, actually, where they say you have to read the Quran in the language it was written in.
Wow.
Because no other human language is capable of expressing the poetic like subtext and meanings that's supposed to get across.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to do the same thing where it works on you on like a different level. Like translating it into English, you wouldn't actually get the thing that's trying to be expressed, you know?
I could see how that would be true.
Yeah.
It's a hell of a project to like learn another language and then learn it in the way that those poetic undertones appealed to a person that was like born speaking that natively.
Right. And then having to do that over the
Yeah.
course of it's been, 1,000 years since
Yeah.
it was written, right? Like,
Well, any of those ancient texts, like it's so difficult to like try to understand what some of that's getting at, but then like I've listened to certain people like interpret like texts of the Bible, and I'm like, whoa, you're really like grabbing something real there.
oh yeah.
And like, it's hard to say like to what extent that was there, or this person is just like an artist at like finding some meaning.
Yeah, right. That's sort of what I was getting at the beginning with like this narrow versus wide reading thing,
Yeah.
where it's like viewed, if you give it just a little bit of, you like be a little generous with your interpretation, you start seeing like, oh, there's a lot of this that makes a lot of sense, right?
Yeah.
And it's like the quibbles are getting caught up on the exact wording of things, which, like in certain senses, like isn't as helpful sometimes, It's just you have to then be able to look for examples or situations in which the interpretation you've been running with actually becomes stopped, and it's like, okay, like clearly this interpretation can't be true. But otherwise there's a sort of possibility space in which you have to just be able to say like, this is a possible interpretation.
I'm trying to make sure I understand what you meant by like the quibbles. The quibbles might not be as helpful, or
Well, like,
remember what you're saying.
yeah. So there's the way in which a lot of things that are being said, like, when we're talking about dimensions, right? Like dimension is a difficult word. Like if you're talking about different dimensions of reality, there's a sense in which you could be talking about like, okay, spatial, temporal, emotional, like planes, right? Dimensions.
Yeah.
But then there's also the science fiction thing of like, oh, a dimension is another universe, It's like,
Right.
in a book like Seth Speaks, the amount of information we've been given, at least in the first couple chapters, and this has to do a lot, I think, with like the more loose usage of synonymous terms and like not spending a lot of time defining terms, right? It leads to there being a hyperposition of multiple possible interpretations that you can kind of consider at the same time, where you're like, this could be dimension in this one sense, or it could be dimension in this other sense. And Seth has not differentiated which one it is yet.
All of them.
Well, but I think some of them are mutually like exclusive.
Right. I mean, you could still use the term dimension, but like, yeah, like some are going to be mutually exclusive. Like we can't be both in a materialistic view and a idealistic view, right? It's one or the other.
Well, like, like my example for that, like there's that quote that I brought up before when he says there are no barriers between systems. That eliminates the interpretation where you might be thinking like there are these contained universes and you like ascend to a new universe by like crossing this barrier and become part of this new universe. And it's like by clarifying there are no barriers between systems, it makes that reading of that word no longer like retroactively no longer correct,
Yeah.
And
but there was a second part to that sentence, right?
Yeah, because it has to have it. Yeah.
I like that.
He
has different versions of that same sentence too that I'm sure will come up.
There are no barriers between systems. The only differentiation is by the ability of personalities to see and manipulate. So my read on that is that personalities see and manipulate the same fundamental reality, but they do so in different ways. And those ways are the dimensions.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's kind of implying that you have to develop your ability to cross into a new dimension.
Well, but you don't cross, right? Because there's no barriers.
Well, I mean, to move in, like however you want to say it, to like...
It's like if you were a person who is colorblind and then you could somehow train your eyes to see colors again, right? It's like you're looking at the same, if you go into a museum or you're an artist and you're like painting something and you're like painting in black and white, like you're seeing it in black and white, but you're using paints to paint. But then you slowly develop the ability to see the colors. It's not that you haven't been painting this whole time. It's that now you're painting in a new dimension, right? The dimension of color.
You're broadening or intensifying reality in some sense.
Right.
But I think of dimension as like, he's saying there's no real barrier. You could just move there, but like you have to have the ability.
Right, but that's all that separates them.
Yeah.
You know? So it's like, in the sense that Seth is like breaking into this dimension, it's not really breaking into the dimension because you can't break into the dimension. There's no barrier, right? Like that's the thing with that quote that like it really threw me for a loop because like I had been thinking of it in terms of, you know, there's all these different like religions or spiritual ways of looking at the world where there's like levels,
Yeah.
discrete like levels of reality. Like, you know, you can ascend the tree of life to go up to like, you know, the plane of the gods or whatever. And it's like, it doesn't seem like it's that, you know?
How about the metaphor of like a radio tuner? Like you're just tuning into frequencies. Does that make it, you can see how it's there, all those frequencies are there. You're not breaking into anything, but your ability to tune into them is what changes.
And the interesting thing about that metaphor is that if somebody's like saying, if you've only ever had your radio tuned to one channel and I suddenly start changing the channels on you, and then you ask me, well, what's happening? And I want to give you an explanation of what's actually, you know, the word actually, right? Actually happening. I can say, no, you don't understand. There are these energies that are traveling in all of these spectrums at once. All these energies are happening together. They're all the part of one thing. So is that metaphorically what's happening here? Is that all these dimensions are actually just different parts of this one larger thing, and that the true quote unquote story is that it's all of it?
Kinda, I think. Okay, I want to say kind of because like, well, first of all, I'm not certain, but like I feel like that is more or less. I mean, there's going to be like some caveats and distinctions probably, but
I suppose the problem is just the problem of like the size of consciousness. For like we are also part of that. Where like us is a part of like a larger us.
Yeah, and part of the problem too is just our understanding is kind of steeped in, you know, like I said, spatial terms and temporal terms. And so like it's just hard to talk about, but probably even harder to understand. Like, you know, at some level, maybe Seth talked about it in chapter 2. Did he talk about like a circular thought, and then a thought exists in a circular manner, and then we put it in a temporal manner in a sentence, so then we can know where we're going in a sentence.
Okay.
And how does that even happen? Just like wherever I was on track, and I just got blown in the breeze. Get us back on track, Joe. Where were we?
Well, you were talking about the aliens from Arrival, right?
Probably.
Where their language is in a big circle and it all happens all at once.
Is that how it happens in that movie?
Have you seen it? I'm pretty sure that's what
A
it
long
is.
time ago I saw it.
Yeah, where
I
like
liked it.
they experience like, I think it's something like they experience like time differently, or they experience it all as like one at the same time, or like they can move back and forth or something. It was kind of a trip. It's a good movie.
Well, maybe some of what we're talking about, it would be helpful to reference like a movie that we both saw recently and a lot of people have seen in the last couple of years, I think. Everything Everywhere All at Once.
You're right, yeah.
Where they're just like, by the end of the movie, you kind of accepted this premise and you're just following this. What's consistent isn't the reality around, but like the personalities that are having the drama. Like the world around them is changing. Sometimes they're in this like white everything bagel world, and sometimes they're still in this IRS building that's like got all these, you know, bodyguards that know kung fu, and just everything. Somehow it all makes sense under the premise that, you know, they have this ability to like kind of create their own reality.
Right. It follows the thing you were saying earlier about probability spaces, right? Where like if you accept like this undivided plane of probabilities, then it sort of makes it so if you can exercise choice in that field, you can still have agency, but there is this sort of mutability to the world around you. Right? Where like if you're the essential consciousness, which would be in the example in the movie, right? Like the guy he's in the van.
Alpha Raymond?
Yeah, Alpha Raymond, right? and they can like put him wherever, and they can use the rest of the probabilities as sort of a resource to like propel him into these other like ways that the world can be.
Yeah.
You know? Or like being alpha in that sense is sort of being a higher level consciousness.
Yeah, he's alpha because he graduated out of the singular dimensional conception of reality and was able to use the multi-dimensional conception of reality to his advantage.
Right. And like even in the movie, right, there's the sense that like she can only make the world, she can like start really exercising her full creative potential when she starts empathizing with each of the different versions of herself. Like there's the, you know, hot dog fingers version of herself that instead of like wrecking their like hot dog marriage, she has to like embrace it.
That's
you know,
a great point. I mean, I knew that one of the reasons I really love that movie is just like it's pretty profoundly emotionally intelligent, but like, yeah, that kind of like justifies like all these other existences that like you need to like call upon your inner being's ability to have all these other experiences and touch on these things, and that is maybe where wisdom actually comes from. You know, we have to like Seth in these first couple chapters is saying like we have to like get our answers from inside.
right? Backtracking for people who might not have seen the movie.
Yeah.
So everywhere, all at once, everything, everywhere, all at once, all the time, forever, anywhere.
Spoiler alert, I guess.
Spoiler alert.
Give a synopsis.
I was gonna try to give a brief one.
Yeah.
So, it follows the story of this woman who has a kind of terrible life. Like she's having a really tough time of life. I guess it's not terrible, but she's having a really tough time of life. She's
in a bad spot.
A laundromat that is starting to have problems with the IRS, and they're getting audited.
She's just kind of not happy with anything.
She's not happy with her career life. She's disappointed at choosing to be a family person and have a family because she's got this rebellious daughter that she's having interpersonal issues with. She's not happy with her husband, who's sort of just this goofy, can't really get anything right type of guy. And she thinks back about how a lot of this results from choices she made at the beginning of her life. And, you know, choosing to marry this guy and have a family has all led up to this inevitable point where she's not happy with what's going on with her life. But then she has this breakthrough of having this character come from outside of her dimensional reality and essentially gives her the ability to move between different alternate possible realities, versions of herself.
He's recruiting her to this like, I don't know if I'd call it like a higher story, but this other plot line
this much more exciting type of lifestyle.
Yeah.
Where there's this interdimensional villain that's trying to destroy everything, and she needs to be the like hero that can like save not only the world but the whole multiverse.
But the villain turns out to be her daughter, who is kind of made by her inability to like accept her and love her in a way, right?
Right. And the villainous thing about her is she's a consciousness that can perceive all dimensions at the same time.
Yeah, she's like, I mean, they're all kind of developing into this like alpha version of themselves, but like her and Raymond are all already kind of there having this battle. And
yeah. And it's sort of a story of the nihilism of that kind of perspective, where once you've seen every different version of yourself, you lose touch with any kind of value judgment.
Yeah, nothing is valuable anymore because it's all meaningless.
And her assertion that the simplicity of choosing one of these lower level lives, or choosing all of these lower level lives just as they are, sort of rehabilitates value back into this higher alpha level experience is sort of the resolution, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, the daughter that becomes a villain, I think her realization is that like it wasn't meaningless. It was only meaningless because she thought her mother's love was being withheld from her.
Right. Because she still, at that level, there were still personalities and needs.
Yeah.
That transcended all of the other versions of herself.
And Yeah, so there's all these other glamorous versions of the protagonist where she's like a movie star and she knows like kung fu and she can like she has these crazy little pinky biceps and stuff.
Right.
But I think maybe my favorite part of that movie is when the Raymond from one of those other worlds where she didn't choose to be with him, he tells her that like the way he fights, because up until this point, it's just like every other movie where like whoever knows the best kung fu wins in the end.
Right.
He says the way he fights is more or less like through love.
Mm-hmm.
And like, because her whole life, this first main character, she's like questioned kind of like this beta goofiness, happy husband she has. And she's kind of like, she just doesn't get how he's always happy. And she's kind of frustrated that he seems like naive in this way. And it turns out like she was the one that was naive. That like he has this like advanced emotional intelligence, like, hey, life's absurd. We should enjoy this. We should love each other.
Right.
And that's kind of her aha moment. And then she can therefore like turn that onto her daughter and, you know, everyone's happy in the end. And happy, like beautifully, it goes back to the same story as the beginning. And the premise is that like she's like now she really is choosing to be in that version.
Right.
Like, she has her daughter. She has this silly husband, and like she's had an awakening. And then in the same way that like you were talking earlier about this graduation into a new dimension, it's there's color in her life. Like,
yeah.
That wasn't there before.
Right. It's like what we were talking about earlier with the accountability. Like the power, she has the power, but then she's able to take responsibility for it, you know, and make choices with that power.
Love that.
Yeah.
Somehow we wrapped that all kind of.
We got it all with a bow. Let's go.
All right.
We did it.
All right. We got to call it.
Yeah.
That's our show, but fear not, the never-ending conversation continues next week. If you're enjoying the show, please be so kind as to subscribe, like, rate, and review. And if you're feeling frisky, tell a friend. Contact us at implicatingthereal@gmail.com. You can support the show at patreon.com/implicatingthereal. We are doing our best, but whatever support you can lend helps us appreciably. We are not affiliated with the publishers or proprietors, but we encourage you to get the books. You can follow along as we endeavor to dive deep into the Sethian worldview, and there's really nothing like cultivating your own relationship with the material. Until next week, we wish you a fond good evening.